In 1962, when we got independence, this was the raw material of society that the NRM was born, forged, and able to lead and bring us where we are today. What are these four groups? The first, an army composed of acephalous. Acephalous societies are those groups that don't have a central authority to rally around. So an army composed of acephalous tribes from the north and northwestern Uganda with limited education. Being in the army was the only means of social ascent. Why? Because education was a preserve of the sons of chiefs and priests, clerks, and administrators. A chief was a judge. A chief was a tax collector. A chief was an administrator, a maintainer of roads. He had the general supervision powers. He was a landowner, as in the case of Buganda, with 8 square miles for each of the chiefs for their usufruct. A study done in 1913 in Busoga, in Buganda, and Nkore shows that not much uncultivated lands fell in the ambit of this land grab. Many lands which were given to chiefs had people living on them already. This was so that the new landlords could collect busul on top of the crown salary. The British picked these acephalous societies in Malawi too, for example, the Awo people, in Burma and Nepal, for example, the Gurkhas, in order so they could deal with centralized monarchies, given that the British, were scared of possible rebellion by people who had a central authority, such as Buganda and Bunyoro. The purpose of indirect rule was to keep tribes apart, isolated from each other by their chiefs and kings, and make us feel different from each other, fear each other. This was so that Africans do not coalesce around a nationalizing central idea that would make these territories ungovernable by the British. Indirect rule, therefore, was not just about cutting costs. It wasn't a franchise by the British government to the imperial British companies, wherever they were, to cut costs. It was a central idea by the British to avert rebellions. This severely affected the building of a national cadreship with a high level of political consciousness. We were tied to tribes as a way of seeing our world. So when you add religion in this mix, given that all schools until the 1950s were owned by and run by the churches, you now can see our troubles as a young Uganda of the 1960s. Category number 2. As a result of limited education, the British built a small civil service from central and western parts of the country. The reason early independence leaders came from these places, and the majority of them were sons of chiefs. Obote and Ibinjira, who would start UPC, were both sons of chiefs. While William Rwetseba of Uganda People's Union from Nkore was the son of the first Nkore priest, a gentleman called Yoweri Buningwire. Frank Kalimzo, who would become our first head of public service and chancellor of Makerere, was the son of a Rwandan prince called Kanyanduga, who was exiled after Rwanda's succession wars of 1894-1895. Apollo Chironde, our first UN ambassador, William Nadiope from Busoga, Dr. Majugo, and later John Kakonge, Secretary General of UPC from Bunyoro, Dr. Kunuka, Bazarabusa, and many of these were sons of priests and chiefs because they had some level of education. A small caliber of civil servants from chiefly backgrounds, in my opinion, had a very limited understanding of the country, and they were facing westward instead of Uganda to deal with the issues of a young emerging country. They would not throw away their jobs to build a nationwide movement to unite Uganda against the British. They could not preside over shifting the fortunes of the majority of the people of Uganda. And even those who tried, like Obote and Musazi before him, they lacked both the means and often were not accepted by other tribes. Group number 3, a small migrant community composed of Indians and coastal people, the Swahili people, Arabs from the coast, dominated trade in textiles, in coffee, in tobacco, tea, and they owned the basic means of industry and manufacturing, basic manufacturing in the country. The integration of this cluster with the rest of Uganda was so slow, even when the first Legislative Council from 1921 had a sprinkling of some of them all the way up to independence. This cluster would be resented on account of their wealth and chased away by Idi Amin in August 1972, bringing Uganda's small enclave economy to a sputter and an eventual collapse. Group number 4. This is the huge 96% of our country, the peasant category, that dominated Uganda by 1969 with no formal means of education and upward ascent in society. My own father, Thomas Ruwabuogo, and millions of Ugandans fell in this category. In Nkore, these type of people are called Karyangoha group, or people who live off an animal to the extent that they would use their teeth and mouth to kill ticks because they had no other source of income or parasites or any form of treatment of both them and the animals, and they had extremely narrow exposure. Many of these peasants also fell in the category of those whose lands had been taken away in the 1900 agreement in Bunyoro, later Bunyoro, in Buganda, in Busoga, in Nkore and Toro. Some of the children of these peasants in Buganda were called Abawejere. They would in 1961 reject the landlessness that they had been exposed to, and they would begin to team up with the new forces, the younger people at the time who would later become the NRM group. These Bawejeres included Abbas Kibazo, Haji Zubair Bakari, John Nachikubye, Haruna Chibuye, Augustine Kamia, many more of that category, including the notorious UPC Haji Musa Sebirumbi, for those of you who are old enough to remember the 80s. Haji Musa Sebirumbi, who would turn away from the centralists of the Bawejere, who did not believe in UPC and DP, and he went on his own. This third group, who I call centrists, were the young Musevens, the young Aboli Malibos, Raito Mongins, the Chive Gingers, the Kategayas, and many others, who by 1972 had given up on trying to work with the old parties and religious groups to shape a new way. So therefore, it is from those 4 groups that I mentioned that political parties emerged and began to be built, and naturally parties had to follow vertical lines of tribe and religion led by the elites, the elite sons of chiefs, and eventually using an illiterate army led by people like Idi Amin, the King's African Rifles, as we later see in our country happened. As you can see from what I described, there was no natural affinity between peasants, the King's African Rifles Army, the sons of chiefs and civil servants. Yet without this affinity, there was no ground to build a new Uganda. There would be divisions, and this is why an alliance of the elite and the army broke down eventually in 1971 in January, with Amin throwing away everything. The alliance between the sons of chiefs and the kingdoms had anyway broken down in February 1966, and soon after, on May 24th, when the army invaded Kabaka's Lubiri in Kampala. In Luganda, we say, Okalyada, Kadada. And what you do will eventually be seen. You do it in secret, but it will be seen. The mistakes of 500 years came to haunt our country. There was no singular dashboard to build from. The reason you see King Mutesa from 1953 to 1961 trying to find a position for Buganda ahead of independence, instead of becoming a rallying point for the country as a whole, given the level of influence he had. My own mother, who was a young girl in Chanaka, in Bulemezi, here in Luwero, at the time, knew about only one influential person in her life in the country, the Kabaka. My mother, who was not a Muganda, loved the Kabaka, and so were so many people who looked up to him to unite the country. What if this Kabaka had used all his influence to reach out and build a platform of unity for entire Uganda? Would we have been the same kind of country that we turned out to be? Well, we cannot tell because we are now using the wisdom of hindsight, and we shouldn't blame anyone. It is safe to assume, though, that we might have avoided the civil wars that lasted for more than 30 years, and who knows, even perhaps we might have stopped Idi Amin.
Would like to hear from you. Please email us at info@tapmedia.com and visit our website at www.tapmedia.com. You can also visit our offices located at Tomosi Business Park, Luzira, Port Bell Road, or call 0414 220 702. Thank you.